It's a great pleasure to be here in Santiago with you today. I have been coming to Chile ever since the early 1990s. I have a lot of friends in this country. I am interested in global democracy, and Chile has played an important role in democracy in Latin America and in the world more broadly. I know that some Chileans wonder if anybody pays attention to what happens in your country. But I can assure you that actually people are paying attention, because Chile has been a bellwether of trends, first going into dictatorship in the 1970s and then coming out of it with the referendum in the late 1980s. And so it is very good to be here with this particular group. As you'll see, I actually have been studying the question of public infrastructure. I think that it is a good test of democratic government, because building public infrastructure is an important public good, but it is also one that is politically extremely difficult to achieve, and I think that different political systems approach this differently. And so I'm going to start with a large overview of what's going on in the world. And then I will progressively focus on the question of infrastructure, the challenge that's being posed right now by China, and the general situation here in Latin America. So let me begin by talking about what the world has been like and how it is changing. We have been living for the last 60, 70 years in what is called the liberal international order. It has an economic component and it has a political component. And both of these components were very much shaped by the power of the United States in the decades following the Second World War. The economic component rests on a system of international institutions that began with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that evolved into the World Trade Organization, and then regional blocs like the European Union, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, that promoted the movement of goods, services, investment, ideas, and people across international borders. There's an important political component to this as well. In the security alliances, initially against the Soviet Union, but later against international terrorism and other kinds of threats to our mutual security, like the North American Treaty Organization, like the security pacts that the United States negotiated with Japan and with South Korea. Now, I think it's important to note that this liberal order was a tremendous success. There's a lot of criticism of so-called neoliberalism today, but people do not adequately appreciate how miraculous this order was. Between 1970 and the economic crisis in 2008, the output of the global economy quadrupled. A tremendous amount of new wealth was created. Hundreds of millions of people exited poverty, not just in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, places like that, but in this region, in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, in virtually all parts of the developing world. This is something I think is very important to keep in mind, the positive impacts of globalization. The political consequences, I think, were also quite striking. In 1970, there were only about 35 electoral democracies around the world. That number rose to about 115, 120 by the first decade of the 21st century. So it was a remarkable expansion of democracy. And here in Chile, as I said, you are one of the prime examples of this shift from dictatorship to a flourishing and active and competitive democracy. My mentor at Harvard University, Samuel Huntington, labeled this the third wave of democratization. And so it was a major shift in global politics where democracy, liberal democracy, became the dominant form of government. Now, in the last decade, we've seen a shift in the nature of world politics. It's something that my colleague Larry Diamond at Stanford labels a democratic recession. So after peaking in about 2008, the number of democracies in the world has been falling ever since then. There have been threats from non-democratic countries. China and Russia are authoritarian countries. They are self-confident. They've been very assertive, and they have posed security challenges and geopolitical challenges to the rest of the world. I'm going to deal with China at the end of my talk in much greater depth. But I think that the most disturbing phenomenon is actually what has been going on within established democracies, with the rise of what's called either populist nationalism or illiberal democracy. So a democracy is really three different institutions all combined in a single package. You have a state, which should be a modern state, meaning one that is devoted to public interest and not to the private interest of the rulers. You have a rule of law that sets legal constraints on the way that elites use power. And finally, you have democratic accountability, which means that the political system has to respond to the wishes of the largest part of the population and not just to the people that run the government. What's been happening in a number of established democracies is that leaders have been elected, they've been legitimately elected by the people, but they have attacked the other two pillars. That is to say, they've attacked the modern state, they've tried to corrupt it, and they have tried to undermine the rule of law, so that, in other words, the democratic part of liberal democracy is being used to undermine the liberal part of liberal democracy. That is to say, the constitutional order that constrains executive power in a true liberal democracy. So this has been going on in a number of countries within the European Union. Hungary and Poland have elected populist governments that have tried to break down the constraints of courts, for example, that have tried to restrict the activities of their leaders. They've tried to dominate the media by having their cronies buy up newspapers. The mainstream media has come under their control. They have put their own party militants within the bureaucracy to make sure that it responds to the party's wishes and not to some impartial public interest. You've now got anti-immigrant parties all over the world that are gaining in power. A populist coalition came to power in Italy last November, so right in the middle of the European Union. You have a number of other parties that have been gaining 25% of the vote in Germany, in France, in many other European countries. And then, finally, you have the United States. These are some of the leaders that I think we're all familiar with at this point that have been elected on a populist basis. Now, it's important to understand what the problem with populism is, because in many respects, populists simply respond to popular sentiment, and that's what you're supposed to do in a democracy. And in fact, there's lots of reasons why people should be upset with the elite policies that have led to this globalized world. The problem is that populism, by definition, means charismatic leadership. A populist leader gets up and says, "You elected me, I represent you, the people. We want to accomplish the following agenda, and here is a court, here is a newspaper, here's a TV station, here's a bureaucracy that doesn't want to follow my wishes, and I represent you. I personally represent you. It's not my party, it's not the constitutional structure, it's me personally." All right? And therefore, they are anti-institutional. They want to undermine the independence of the institutions that constitute a true liberal democracy. I normally don't like to criticize my own government when I'm traveling abroad, but I think that in the case of the United States, we have a glaring example of that in our current president, Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, when he accepted the nomination of the Republican Party in 2016, said, "I alone understand your problems and I alone can fix them." This is the kind of language that Juan Perón used to use in Argentina. I personally am the representative of you, the American people, and as a result, he has been highly anti-institutional. He's attacked his own intelligence community, the FBI, his own attorney general. He said that the mainstream media in the United States were enemies of the American people. He has tried to undermine the independence. So one of the great achievements, I think, here in Chile, in Latin America more generally, has been the independence of central banks. Central banks should be run by people that know about monetary policy and not by politicians that simply serve the short-term interests of the political party in power. But even this in the United States has come under attack, with the effort to stack the Federal Reserve Board with political allies of the current president. And so this is an example. It's a poor example that's being set by the leading democratic country in the world, and this is something that is now being imitated by populists in many other parts of the world. Now, the thing that distinguishes this group of populists from the kinds of populists that you are familiar with in Latin America is that these are populists of the right. Latin America has been filled with populists of the left, like the Kirchners in Argentina, like Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro, that are based on the many poor people in this region, which is one of the most highly unequal regions in the entire world. What's interesting about the new populists is that they come from the right, and their main issues have to do with things like national identity, immigration, and the preservation of a certain set of traditional conservative values. And it's very interesting that this has happened because you would think that with the growing inequality that has been produced by globalization, you would see the surge of left-wing populism. That is happening in certain places with Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and so forth, but the dominant political movements over the past decade have been these ones on the right. And I think the reason for that lies in the importance of culture and identity as drivers of this shift. So if we think about why this is happening at the current moment, I think there are three reasons. There's an economic one, a political one, and a cultural one. Now, the economic explanation for the rise of populism is probably the most widespread, and it's become a kind of conventional wisdom. Globalization has produced tremendous new wealth, but not every individual in every country is doing well. And in particular, low-skilled workers in rich countries have been losing jobs and employment opportunities to rising middle classes in developing countries. And so much of the manufacturing capacity of the United States has left the Midwest, and it's gone to China, to Vietnam, to other places in the developing world. And I think that this has led to a social crisis among the old working class, not just in the United States, but in many other parts of the rich world, in Europe as well. And so this is, I think, fairly well recognized as one of the triggers for a backlash against globalization. And it's set up this interesting dynamic where the major division in the world socially is really based on your level of education. If you have a university education, if you live in a city that is well connected to the outside world, you benefit from globalization. You are used to seeing a diversity of people living around you. You live in a very pluralistic society. you're open to new ideas, and therefore you are a supporter of this liberal international order. On the other hand, if you live in a smaller city, if you live in the countryside, if you're less educated, you don't have the ability to take advantage of the kind of mobility that the current world offers you, you tend to vote for a populist party. So this, I think, has now become, I understand, for example, that Santiago now has almost half of Chile's population, right? This is something that's going on in very many countries. You know, in Britain, London has dominated all of the smaller cities. You know, manufacturing used to be spread out across the United Kingdom, and now, you know, probably 80% of the economic activity of the entire country takes place in the greater London area. So this kind of social division is occurring all over the world, and I think it is driving a lot of the voters who are voting for these populist parties. Second issue is political. The problem with democracies and the complaint against democracies is that they are slow. They have interest groups, they have parliaments, they have discussion and debate and negotiation, and oftentimes they do not deliver on basic issues that people want and demand. They don't deliver education, health, pensions, infrastructure, right? In my own country, we are not very good at building things because there are too many constraints that are posed by law, by regulation, by compliance, and as a result, we don't get our highways, we don't get our 5G networks, and the like. So this creates a demand then for strong leaders. That's why we want these outsiders that claim that they can cut through all of the nonsense that goes on in Congress or in the Parliament and get things done, right? The final issue, however, I think is a critical one, which has to do with culture and immigration. Because one of the characteristics of this new world is the large-scale movement of people across international borders. In virtually every Western European country now, you have anywhere from about 10 to almost 30% of the population being born outside of the country. And these are in societies that had been ethnically very homogeneous in prior generations. The Germans used to say that we're not like the United States, we're not a country of immigration. Today, the Germans have as many foreign-born people in their borders as the United States does. And this, I think, has created a threat to identity, that many of the groups that thought that they constituted the average middle-class person in their society now sees the country filling up with people from other parts of the world. They speak different languages, they have different religions, different customs, and this becomes a threat to their sense of control because a lot of the immigration is desired by elites that benefit from cheap labor, but it doesn't seem to benefit those ordinary people that are threatened with the loss of jobs as a result of globalization. And so one of the consistent issues for these anti-system parties, these anti-elite parties, is opposition to immigration. This is the nature of what I call the politics of dignity, because all of us human beings have a sense of our inner worth. We believe that we have a certain intrinsic value, and we want other people to recognize that. And if they don't recognize it, we get very angry. And oftentimes that anger drives us into politics, and it makes us demand things that are contrary to our material self-interest. So for example, in the Brexit debate, many of the Remain supporters, the ones that wanted to stay in the European Union, would lecture the pro-Brexit people. They'd say, you don't understand the nature of economics, you don't understand that we're going to lose jobs, the City of London is going to suffer, that a lot of our industries are going to lose competitive advantage if we withdraw from the European Union. And I think a lot of the Brexit supporters said, well, thank you very much. but I think we know our own self-interest. We are willing to accept a loss of jobs and a loss of income if it allows us to regain control over our borders and to keep these foreigners from coming into the country and changing our national identity. And this, I think, is a consistent issue for many of these parties of the right. Now, in Latin America, things are a little bit different because you don't have, the same kinds of linguistic homogeneity that distinguishes Germany from the Netherlands, from Italy, that you do in Europe. But that cultural issue, nonetheless, I think is there. In Latin America, I think that there are some important shifts that have been going on when you think about the different components of a modern democracy. So as I said, you have these three separate pillars on which liberal democracy rests. You have a modern state, meaning an uncorrupt state that is devoted to public interest, in which there's a sharp separation of private interest from public interest. You have the rule of law that restricts the power of elites, and you have democratic accountability. Now, I think that in the past generation, the struggle was really for democracy. It was for coming out of the military dictatorships that had taken over from the 1960s going forward. And in that struggle, it's not completed, so you still have Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, a number of remaining dictatorships, but that transition to democracy has actually been remarkably successful. I don't think that too many people in this country worry about the military seizing power again. In Argentina, despite a very severe economic crisis in 2001, nobody thought about asking the Argentine military to step back into power. Same thing, I think, goes for Brazil, although under Bolsonaro there's been a little bit of sympathy for the dictatorship, but I don't think that that's a realistic possibility. So I think the democratic part of those three pillars have been fairly well established. So that's the strength, I think, of politics in Latin America today. The weaknesses, I think, lie in the first two pillars, and particularly in the failure to create modern states. Corruption is a pervasive problem throughout the region. The entire region has been shocked by the Odebrecht scandal proceeding out of Brazil, but that's just a symptom of a larger problem of public officials being willing to use their offices for personal gain. And in Brazil, I think the revelations of the Lava Jato investigations have shown that that kind of corruption is pervasive among the political elites and among the business elites. And that is really at the source of the rise of someone like Jair Bolsonaro, whose single issue was opposition to an existing corrupt establishment. That is what's roiling the politics of Peru and many other countries in this region. And so the big failure, I think, in Latin America up till now has been this failure to create a modern state, a permanent bureaucracy that is selected on the basis of merit and expertise rather than as a matter of political patronage. In this respect, I think Chile has done better than many of its neighbors, but even here, I think that remains a challenge. Rule of law is something that is a crisis in many parts of Latin America because of narco trafficking, because of the basic inability of governments in Mexico, in Colombia, in Central America to actually be able to provide citizen security across their entire territory. That's one of the most fundamental characteristics of a state, regardless of whether it's democratic or not, and this is something they have not been able to do. And therefore, you have different kinds of populisms in this region. A traditional populism of the left is that we see now in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and so forth, but also now this new right-wing populism represented by Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil. And that is a threat I think all of us need to be vigilant about, because although Latin America socially is different from Europe and from North America, I think that threat still exists, the threat of charismatic leaders that promise the people direct action that will solve their problems. It's a lie. These leaders are never able to deliver on this, but the promise is sufficient to get them elected to office. I was asked to say a little bit about the end of history, my famous article, and I will just tell you that, and actually this is a good segue into the discussion of China. So what the end of history meant when I wrote about it almost 30 years ago was history in the sense of Hegel and Marx, the philosophers Hegel and Marx, that saw history as the equivalent of modernization or development. And the word end of history was not the termination, it was in what direction is history proceeding as countries modernized. Karl Marx said that the end of history would be a communist utopia, but Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, said the end of history is going to be a liberal state. And my argument back in 1989 was that Hegel looked like he was more correct than Marx, that we weren't going to get to communism, and that the terminal point of modernization was going to be something like a liberal democracy tied to a market economy. And that's the question that we have before us today. Is liberal democracy the highest form of social organization, or is there something better out there? I don't think that recent attempts like 21st century socialism have really made a very good case for something lying beyond liberal democracy. But there's one country in the world that does pose a real challenge, a serious challenge to this model, and that country is China. China is authoritarian. There's no pretense that it's being a democracy ruled by a communist party, and yet it has achieved a historically unprecedented growth rate over the past 30 years, and at some point is likely to overtake the United States as the single largest economy in the world, and perhaps in another generation may reach the level of the United States in terms of per capita income. And so this model is the only one out there that has a real plausible chance of doing better than the United States, and it has an effect on other countries around the world because they say, look at the US, look at Europe. They're in financial crisis, they're in political turmoil, they have populism, people are unhappy, and here's China moving ahead. So I want to say a little bit. So this is the part of the talk where I'm going to focus on your issue, which is the issue of public infrastructure, because this is the one area in which there's a very sharp difference between China and the model that is being posed by the West. So if you look at the share of public investment or investment by development banks going into infrastructure around the world, in the year 2002, there are two big Chinese banks, the China Development Bank and the China Import-Export Bank. And as you can see from this chart, in the year 2002, they constituted about 1/4 of all of the public investment when compared to the World Bank, to the Asian Development Bank, to the African Development Bank, to the Inter-American Development Bank. By the year 2009, those two Chinese banks began to constitute more than 50% of global infrastructure development. And in 2016, it's basically 3/4. So all of those other international multilateral development banks now are only 1/4 of the total amount of capital being spent on public infrastructure in the world today. The Chinese have basically taken over that sector. Now, if you look at the competing development models, the Chinese model is really quite different from the market-driven Western model that's being promoted in the United States. So in the United States, we say the public sector can allocate capital the most efficiently. If there's no market for something, the state has no business in directing investment. The Chinese do not believe that. The Chinese have used their public agencies, their state-owned enterprises, to direct the nature of their investment, and in recent years, up to 50% of Chinese GDP has been directed to new investment, particularly in public infrastructure. By the way, this is not too different from other fast developing countries in East Asia, like South Korea, Taiwan in an earlier period, Japan, and so forth, all right? There's a very high savings rate in China, and so there are a lot of fiscal resources available for this kind of investment. In the United States, we have shifted away from public infrastructure domestically. First of all, the United States is a big debtor country. We've got a huge annual budget deficit. We have a big stock of debt that's now reaching something like 80% of GDP. We have political gridlock that, President Trump, in fact, last week suggested a new big public infrastructure push, and it was dead on arrival because his own Republican Party would not support it. And as I said, there's a very high cost to compliance with safeguards in investment in domestic American projects, which is why we have a lot of bridges falling down, why we are not building new tunnels into New York City, why airports are falling behind, and the like. And so in this respect, the Chinese model seems to have a lot of advantages. I think that if you look at what's driving the Chinese in this area, there's three arguments that have been made as to why they're doing this and why they're making this big push. The Belt and Road Initiative has been one of the biggest foreign policy initiatives of any country. It's staggering the scale of the ambition of this project. They're talking about investments of a couple $1 trillion over the next decade or two to reorient the entire center of gravity of the world economy away from the trans-Pacific, transatlantic trade that currently dominates it to a corridor stretching from Western China into the Middle East, through Central Asia, and into Europe. So there are three advantages that people speak of the Chinese having. One is the fact that they're authoritarian. The second one has to do with their foreign policy objectives, and the third has to do with domestic industrial policy. Let me talk about each of these in turn. So China does not have to worry about compliance with a lot of safeguards. This is the single thing that distinguishes a Chinese infrastructure project from a Western one. If the World Bank does an infrastructure project, it has to meet environmental, safety, labor requirements. They have to do consultations with indigenous peoples. They have to get political buy-in from a lot of the interest groups that exist within a society. And China doesn't worry about this. China basically accepts whatever level of safeguards exist in a developing country. If it's a highly corrupt country, they say, fine, we'll bribe the right official to get the contract, and then it will go ahead. And so being an authoritarian country gives them an advantage in this regard. I believe that it is a short-term advantage because there's good reasons why there's compliance with safeguards for the long term in terms of environmental damage and the like, but that does allow the Chinese to underbid many Western projects. All right? Now, I think that these advantages can be overstated when China goes out to developing countries because they have these advantages when they were investing in infrastructure in China itself. They controlled all the variables, but in other countries, many of which are democracies, they actually have to meet the standards of the local country. So they've done projects in Peru, in Ecuador, in Argentina, and they're finding that they're getting a lot of pushback because local groups actually exist in a democratic political system, and when the Chinese bulldoze an ancient burial site for an indigenous group, it turns out that people get angry about it and they don't like the Chinese, they protest and they use the political system to prevent this from happening in the future. And so the Chinese are finding that they have to adjust to the democratic conditions that they're meeting in many parts of the developing world. Now, the strategic international competition, I think, is one of the biggest explanations for why the Chinese are doing this. They have commercial motives. Their companies want to make money, but the government wants to use infrastructure as a way of projecting influence. They want to show developing countries that they can provide electricity, roads, clean water, telecommunications, and they can do it faster and more effectively than their Western counterparts. And so this is part of a going out strategy that's intended to build Chinese influence around the world. And so I think that there are many places where you simply cannot explain why the Chinese are investing the way they are, but for the desire to gain this kind of geopolitical advantage. No Western investor would go into the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the poorest and most badly governed and corrupt countries in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and yet the Chinese have put a multi-billion-dollar, a couple of multi-billion-dollar dam projects into that country because of their interest in securing strategic commodities and also building influence in that part of Africa. I think that this is actually of limited value to them because in many countries where they're heavily invested, they produced a political backlash that has resulted in the country shifting sides away from China. This happened in Myanmar, where the whole opening to the West occurred because the people of Myanmar were afraid of becoming a colony of China. Something similar happened in Sri Lanka. Something is going on like this in Malaysia, where the 1MDB scandal that was fueled by Chinese money has had a big impact in their political elite with the return of Mr. Mahathir as the prime minister. The final driver is basically Chinese internal politics. China is slowing down internally. They have the largest construction companies in the world. They employ millions of people in their construction industry. There aren't enough jobs for them in China, and therefore they're sending out these workers to developing countries. So at the moment, there are estimates that there are like somewhere between 1 and 2 million Chinese workers in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And this actually is a source of friction with many developing countries because when the Chinese do an investment, they don't hire local people typically. They don't transfer a lot of technology. They bring their own workers, their own countries. They tie it up in a big package so that the local government really doesn't have to get involved very much at all. But it also doesn't provide the same sorts of spillover advantages for the country receiving the investment that would happen if a Western consortium were doing that. Nonetheless, they also want to make money, and so this leads to these big contradictions in Chinese policy where the government is telling a state-owned enterprise to do a project. They don't want to do it because they don't think it's going to be a money-making enterprise, but they're forced to anyhow because of the authoritarian political system. Now, I think that as we've looked at it, we did a study at Stanford with some people in the School of Engineering looking at projects across the developing world, infrastructure projects, and there's a big difference, I think, in the approach between a Western consortium and the Chinese. So the Western approach is, and this is something I don't have to tell this audience, you focus on the internal rate of return, right? You do this typical calculation where you look at your capital costs, you look at the cash flow, the present discounted cash flow over time, and if you get a positive return, you do the project if it's worth the risk, and if it's not, you step away from it. Now, most public infrastructure projects actually are not profit-making operations. Those that are get done by the private sector, but oftentimes a public agency like the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank, or a bilateral development bank needs to step in because these projects are risky and they don't actually produce adequate returns for their investors. The Chinese approach is much more complicated. They obviously do calculate internal rates of return, so all of the big Chinese SOEs like China Harbor Engineering or the China Railway Company want to make money, so they calculate the internal rate of return. But the big difference between the West and China is in their calculation of external rates of return. That is to say, the externalities that are produced by an infrastructure investment, and these are both positive and negative. I think based on their own experience in China, the Chinese tend to overestimate the positive externalities in terms of the amount of growth that is going to be produced by the investment, and they underestimate the negative externalities, meaning environmental damage, social disruption, and the like. And this is a price they're paying in China itself. 1/5 of all agricultural land in China is too polluted to be used for human food consumption because they did not care about environmental damage of their rapid economic growth. And so if you don't worry about environmental safeguards in China, you're not going to worry about them in Africa or in Latin America. And so you have projects like the Coco Sinclair Dam in Ecuador that have actually produced severe environmental consequences, and that's something the Chinese simply didn't calculate when they did the initial investment. So the consequence of this actually is that this Chinese approach to rapid development through infrastructure investment doesn't work very well outside of China because they can't capture the positive externalities, right? They're investing in places for strategic advantage. It may give them a temporary foreign policy benefit, but in the long run, it's a loss-making investment both for the Chinese company and for the local government. Just to give you an example of the way that the Chinese think about these things, you're probably aware of the high-speed rail network in China. It's an order of magnitude larger than any other high-speed rail network in any other country. The Chinese have invested $750 billion in this network over the past 15 years. It's a stunning amount of money, and it doesn't come close to paying for itself. And it has contributed to the overall weakness in the Chinese financial system because their level of borrowing to finance this network has risen, pretty much in a linear fashion with the expenditures on the rail network itself. And so they lose a tremendous amount of money on this particular piece of infrastructure. And this shows you, I think, one of the consequences of what the Chinese are doing in the developing world. So they have also lost a lot of money in their public infrastructure projects in the developing world. A couple of years ago, the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank had to be bailed out by the Central Bank of China to the tune of something like $90 billion, which I think is an estimate of the aggregate losses that Chinese enterprises have taken on their infrastructure investments in developing countries. And this is a pattern that is continuing into the present. So this is a very, very costly foreign policy on China's part. If they're trying to buy foreign influence, they've not been terribly successful in many parts of the world because there's backlash against China, and it also costs them a lot of their domestic reserves in order to keep this kind of system going. And so I would say that, yes, there are Chinese advantages. They can do things quickly and cheaply, but for the country that's receiving the investment, it's a two-edged sword because they don't take account of all of the negative externalities that come with this kind of rapid infrastructure development. They don't estimate political risk very well, and as a result, instead of being a win-win situation, as Xi Jinping keeps saying, for many countries it's actually a lose-lose situation. The Chinese lose money, and the local country loses environment, worker safety, a lot of other things. And so finally, I think if you look at the Western model, we've got problems ourselves because we've not been very helpful in terms of promoting infrastructure development around the world. I think the compliance standards that are set by Western international organizations, development banks, is actually at the opposite end of the scale from the Chinese. They're too high. They're too demanding. Developing countries are forced to comply with a level of safeguards that are not even used in Scandinavia or in California. And they can't meet those standards, and therefore they either don't do the projects, or they go to the Chinese, or there's corruption in the procurement process, and that's not a good outcome either. So I'm going to conclude my talk here. This bit on infrastructure is a little bit of a microcosm, I think, of the larger question that's raised by the end of history. Do the Chinese have a better development model in the long run than the Western liberal democratic capitalist one? And I would say they have a short-term advantage. The Chinese have a short-term advantage. They can do things quickly, efficiently, and they've produced, very good results up to this point. But the fact that they don't comply with the kinds of rules and safeguards and conditions that Western societies impose on themselves means that in the long run, they're going to pay a price and we're going to pay a price for it. So I think the question of the end of history is still not quite resolved. I think that even if China looks better at the present moment, there are a number of reasons for thinking that in 10, 20, 30 years, that record is not going to seem as positive as it may seem today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion.